This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley, Ruxton by Philip Verrill Mighels. Chapter 13. Elements of Complication. When she glanced again toward the crowds in the ring, the woman of icy eyes had disappeared. By then the nature of the show had undergone a change. The interval between events in the ring was seized upon with astonishing avidity by scores and droves of box inhabitants, eager to avail themselves of nearer inspection of, or an introduction to, the royal little person who had come to their show beneath the wing of Alice Van Kirk. The fortification was besieged. Dozens of the younger men, nearly as many of their elders, and women in bevies crowded to the place, numbers to halt in the promenade, but the vast majority to juggle for presentation to the princess. It ceased to be a horse show and became a royal levee. Confused and excited, but growing momentarily more gracious and girlish, even as she grew more beautiful, with the flush of colour in her cheeks, Thurley could barely murmur a conventional formula to each one thus presented, and think with terror on the utter impossibility of ever remembering all those names and faces. Alice Van Kirk, meantime, was hardly less occupied than Thurley to manage her own situation with the diplomatic adroitness demanded by the moment. She was smothered with honours, invitations, and a popularity absolutely overwhelming. A score of attentions and recognitions she coveted were indiscriminately mingled with twice as many more she wished to scorn. The younger men, whom first of all she wished to magnetize, aware that success in her social ambitions would follow where they led, had multiplied to alarming numbers in a flash. Her triumph was a species of landslide of inconvenient propositions. She did not know, and could not have known at the moment, that with all these men it was Thurley's exquisite beauty, her irresistible personality and radiant charm, more than all her advertised royalty of origin, that wrought the magnetic spell. She only saw her protégée growing instantly more and more an object of something akin to social worship, and more secure in her hold upon the novelty-loving, ennui-haunted beings of their world. The next event in the arena was the judging of 5 pairs, geldings and mares, shown to phaetons, women to drive. The band was playing selections from the latest musical comedy as the proud matched animals and their skilful drivers swung briskly in upon the tan-bark ring. Thurley was instantly all attention as before, from sheer love of the horses and their management. Dimly aware that Count Fieschi, Robley Stuyvesant, not to mention the Baron, the Captain, and the Beau, were waging a silent sort of war for the place at her side, she turned from them all to the bright arena, leaning girlishly forward in her fervour. A man of middle age, with a moustache obviously grown in resemblance to that of Kaiser William, took one keen scrutinizing inventory of the girl's unusual features, nodded once as if to himself, and disappeared in the throng. He was the second curious individual who had waited for a clear, unobstructed view of her face, for reasons that were not merely curiosity or admiration. There was still a third such being in the garden, another woman, one of the humblest of the humble, a worker out of employment, consumed with love of things in the unattainable highest social stratum, and now far out in the tide of the crush that slowly paraded by the box where Thurley was sitting in her splendour. She was Thurley's cousin. She had seen the princess from across the ring, and, unable to credit her senses, or believe it was she, was slowly working forward with the press, fearful lest Thurley might at any moment rise and depart before she could come sufficiently close, perhaps to attract her gaze. Meantime, the person with the Kaiser adornment on his upper lip, having cleared the close-packed audience before the royal box, made rapid progress down the garden to the rear, where horses in waiting, with carriages, grooms, and footmen, were screened from the general view, and, saluting a tall, whiskered foreigner, stepped nimbly aside to report. "It is she," he stated, murmuring his statement in German. "I should know her in a million, though I saw her but once at court." "She saw you? She might have known you," demanded the other, with evident impatience. "What of that?" The smaller man shook a violent negative. "She neither saw me, nor would she know me by any possibility, though she looked for an hour in my face." The other turned and struck with his fist his palm. "The folly, the headstrong folly of her escapade, and to show herself in public like this here. We are helpless to move. We can only at most report." He started in a feverish stride past the carriages and servants, and so, emerging from behind the screen at its opposite end, continued down on the farther side of the oval, making his way to the exit of the garden. Once he paused, with his agent at his heels, to glance half resentfully across the ring at the girl on the opposite side. "So beautiful, so conspicuous," he muttered in throaty German. "The peril, the perpetual disaster of beauty." He shrugged his shoulders, continued on and out the door, and was driven away, still accompanied by his man, in a limousine car that was waiting for him. Thurley's relative, during this brief period, had wormed her way to a gap in the fringe of people leaning on the rail about the ring, and there she caught at an anchorage from which to make her observations. She was small and insignificant, this poor bit of drift in the daily tides of Gotham, a woman of perhaps 33, rather white of face, slender and nervous. She bore not the slightest resemblance to Thurley, at whom she was gazing now with faculties utterly bewildered. In one moment certain, in the next unconvinced, that a being so glorious, so radiant, so obviously one of New York's elite, could possibly have any identity with Thurley Ruxton. She lost all sense of judgment. There were moments when Alice's protégé seemed unmistakably the cousin from New Haven. In the next she appeared absolutely another individual, not even so remarkably like Thurley after all. It seemed, moreover, preposterous that Thurley could have come to this estate. Nothing in reason could account for her elevation thus to such patent favoritism with swelldoms exacting and reluctant monarchs. And then presently, to the dulled perception of the eager woman's ears, came the tag end of a conversation, every part of which she might have overheard. A man was speaking, one hall-marked with patrician manners. "Yes," he agreed, as if upon mature reflection and estimate, eyeing Thurley through half-closed lids, as a connoisseur squints at a painting. "She quite fulfills the final requirements in a princess. The first I ever saw that did. For the most part they're a bally, homely lot. Princess Thurvinia, I confess my ignorance of her state, but that hair, that Flemish hair, I should know that in the dark." Thurley's cousin gazed at the princess with newer interest. All question instantly banished from her mind. She could see it was not Thurley now, and felt herself flattered in that seat of her former doubt that had argued to utter absurdity of such social eminence for the girl who had not so long before taught students in the classic shades of Yale. But she did not move. She was singularly fascinated by this juxtaposition with royalty. It was almost marvellous just to be granted this fateful opportunity of feasting her eyes and soul for once on the beauty and graciousness of one so nobly born, and reigning in the court of elegance and wealth presented here, where all the worthwhile world was paying homage. Attentions to Thurley in the box, indeed, had rendered even casual regard of the horses out of the question. In vain the fair drivers whipped their pairs to speed and high-stepping action. It was Thurley's hour despite herself, and Alice was fairly dazed by the unanimity with which the eager social set was plunging into self-delusion. Events in the ring succeeded one another in a mere routine, made lifeless and colourless by the greater magnetism at the box. Thurley had scarcely had time for more than mere quick glances at the horses of the show, and Alice was thinking of the wisdom of retreat. 15 saddle horses for women were brought to the oval, and Thurley wished with all her heart she might enjoy them exclusively, and be herself forgotten for a little time in which to catch at her wits. She turned in her chair, looking out on the ring, and then at the faces closer by. Her glance was caught of a sudden by the white immobility of her cousin's countenance, as the latter stood by the wooden rail, transfixed by delight and adoration. Instantly a shade of colour dropped from Thurley's cheeks, only to rush back as quickly in a hotter, deeper flood of disordered emotions. Her recognition of the small, slender figure had been immediate, and no less swift had been a tumult of conflict in her brain and heart as to what she ought to do. Her impulse prompted her head to nod, her lips to curve in a smile of old affection, and her spirit to burn its lamps of loyalty and welcome in her eyes. Her calculation and underlying consciousness of the obligation due to Alice Van Kirk relentlessly put on their check. Confused, incapable of weighing a matter so unexpectedly confronting her judgment for decision, she did nothing at all save to grasp at control of her faculties, and her cousin decided in her stead, already convinced that she was gazing at Princess Thurvinia. The pale little hero worshipper merely blanched a bit whiter, thus to be detected at her staring, fluttered her eyes in an effort to recover her wavering wits, and turned to the horses in the ring. Thurley rose and met the solicitous scrutiny of Alice's eyes. She smiled with a forced restoration of her poise, her one desire now being to escape as soon as possible. "Shall we go?" she said. It must be nearly over." "By all means, my dear," Alice answered gladly, and the evening's farewells were quickly and quietly exchanged. Still in a lingering haze of doubt, unrest, and trifling apprehension lest the presence of her cousin in the town might possibly compromise or even jeopardize her new position in the social world, Thurley followed mechanically where their escorts led the way. Then out in the marble corridor of the building, facing the draught of November air that swept in through the open doors, she received again a peculiar wireless shock for which she could have supplied no explanation. That same foreign-looking woman of the pale olive face and ice-blue eyes was standing over against the wall, her gaze hard set and concentrated on Thurley's striking features. Again that sense of something baleful and menacing, tinged the girl's nerves with chill as she met the glitter of the other woman's scrutiny. She did not observe a small, dark man, with eyes as shifty as those of a coon, who glanced from herself to the woman by the wall, then leisurely followed from the place. Almost with the same alacrity with which a carriage attendant on the curb outside summoned Alice's car to receive its passengers, a second such person called up a nearby taxicab, into which the small dark man was fairly shunted. When Alice's car rolled up the avenue, the other tagged it unobtrusively at a distance of discretion in the rear. End of chapter 13.